Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
This summer, the U.S. has seen a drastic increase in the number of children arriving at its southern border from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. In 2008, approximately 6,000 children from those countries sought sanctuary in the U.S. So far in 2014, the number has swelled to 52,000 and could reach as many as 90,000 by the end of the year. Regional wars and violent street gangs are forcing these children to flee their homes en masse. And while current U.S. policy states these children must be given the opportunity to explain why they need protection, the surge of refugees is overwhelming U.S. resources. Right now, many of the Central American children are held in poor living conditions without access to care and medicine. This month on Access Minnesota, we talked to Michelle Garnett McKenzie and Dipender Mayel from the Minneapolis-based Advocates for Human Rights on what is happening at the border and what can be done about the crisis. We have two guests from the Advocates for Human Rights based in Minneapolis. Michelle Garnett McKenzie is the director of the Advocates Advocacy Program, and Dipender Mayel is the director of the organization's Refugee and Immigrant Program. Michelle, Dipender, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Thank you for having us on today.
Thank you. The number of refugee children reaching the U.S. border is estimated to be as much as 90,000 by the end of this year. Right now, what is happening to those children when they reach the border?
So when children arrive at the United States, just like when adults do, they are coming into contact with the Border Patrol. They generally are turning themselves in to Border Patrol, and then they're taken into custody. They're held by U.S. Border Patrol for anywhere from a few hours to several days, often in just short-term detention facilities that are really designed for fewer than 72 hours of detention. Then children are transferred to the custody of the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement, where kids are able to stay in a shelter care facility. Ideally, in past years, when the numbers were much smaller, kids went into a shelter care facility that had educational programs and some stability while they were able to be either reunited with their families back home or somewhere in the United States. But now, with the system under so much stress, many of these kids are in different kinds of facilities, Air Force bases, bigger unused military facilities where they are kind of cobbling together those services. So they're being held sometimes for several months while they're waiting to find family members to release them to or to deport them.
What are the conditions like in those facilities?
So what we've been hearing and the reports that we have heard are that the conditions can often be pretty deplorable. We have heard that in some facilities there's children are cold, they are sick, they are not provided with, families aren't provided with enough blankets, that sometimes if someone comes across the border through the river and is soaking wet, they've been held in their wet clothes for days. They're not given adequate food, not necessarily been given adequate medicine. And again, a lot of these conditions, we don't know exactly what's going on. A lot of these children and families are being held behind walls where there's not much visibility and not much accountability. But what we're hearing is pretty egregious.
How many children were reaching the U.S.-Mexican border in past years, and what accounts for this tremendous increase?
In past years, we saw around 5,000 or 6,000 unaccompanied children coming to the U.S.-Mexico border every year from a variety of countries, including Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and then other countries as well coming through Mexico. In the past several years, that pattern has really changed, and we've seen dramatically increased numbers of kids from three countries: Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Those countries are really in the midst of what is essentially a civil war with gangs taking over and holding territory, really running the countries or parts of the countries, and keeping or propelling kids to flee, and sometimes families to flee, out of fear of extreme violence, out of fear of being forcibly conscripted into the gangs, or even forced to serve as girlfriends or sex slaves to the gangs. So we've seen a dramatic rise from those countries, not just the United States, but countries around the region. Mexico, Nicaragua, all have seen increases in the triple digits in the number of people seeking asylum, children seeking asylum from Nicaragua, or from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala.
How are these refugees reaching the U.S. border? What modes of transportation are they using?
Like many refugees, they come any way that they can, but really the mode of transportation from these three countries is an overland route that will take them through Mexico, either in some type of vehicle, a car, or on a train, or what is known as the beast to some, which is a very dangerous route. And then being passed from one human trafficker or coyote to another until there is an actual walk across the border, and then they're usually either received on the other side, but in the situation with refugees, many of them are simply finding out Border Patrol agents to turn themselves in.
What is the current U.S. policy regarding children who are seeking asylum here in the U.S.?
The U.S. policy regarding kids seeking asylum in the United States is really complicated because it's an internationally recognized standard for asylum that was developed and really the whole system was contemplated for adults. But a child seeking asylum goes through essentially that same system and has to make the same standard, meet the same standard of proof, make the same legal showing, really convince a judge that they need to stay because they're afraid they will be persecuted on account of their race, their religion, their nationality, their social group, or their political opinion. So when children arrive at the border and they're deemed to be unaccompanied children, they're not in the company of their parents or guardians, and they are found to be not from Mexico or Canada, because we have special rules for contiguous countries, but not from those two countries, they are allowed to be put into a shelter care facility because they've been found to be unaccompanied, and screened for whether they should apply or can apply for asylum in the United States. If they meet that screening, they're allowed to file an asylum application, usually in front of a non-adversarial part of the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service called the Asylum Office. But they are also at the same time in what's known as removal proceedings, or the legal process to get them deported from the United States. And so the kids have to show up in court, they have to articulate their cases, they have to fill out a very complicated form. That the form alone is 13 pages with 15 pages of instructions in English, along with supporting evidence and expert witnesses and determinations about their social group that they get from a psychologist or a sociologist. All these very complicated things. They need to get that into the adjudication authorities and then show up in court and really present their testimony. Very complicated situation. For Mexican kids, the standard is a little different, and they can be removed more quickly because of really agreements that were made by Congress early on in the later part of the last decade.
And I should add, the United States asylum law is based on their obligations under international law, obligations that really came around after World War II to protect refugees and people fleeing persecution. And a child or a family who comes in through this route is going to have to present their case and prove to the United States that they're eligible for asylum. But whether you're a child or whether you're elderly, whether you speak English or you're incapacitated, you will be held to the same legal standard, and you will not be provided an attorney at all. When you are in court, and the proceedings are very complicated, very difficult, and without a lawyer to navigate this bureaucracy, without enough time to present your case, and when you're in detention and when you're held in difficult conditions, it's hard enough for anybody to think, let alone an infant or a child. But they will be held to the same standard that a doctor or a police officer or a political party leader will be held to when they come into the United States and ask for persecution. This is not an easy standard to meet, and without proper protections put into place, without attorneys for these children and for these families, many of them are not going to meet the standard, even though they should be getting the protection.
Has any effort been made to provide legal counsel for these refugees seeking asylum?
There have been some efforts, and those efforts are really because of volunteers and charitable sentiments. Nothing is being provided by the government. Not a single dime is being put towards hiring attorneys for these individuals. There are volunteer attorneys going from around the country through the American Immigration and Lawyers Association to Artesia, New Mexico, where there is a family detention center which is holding 600 people right now. There are lawyers from Minnesota trying to volunteer, and there are children and families being processed on an expedited juvenile docket here in Minnesota, and there are lawyers helping them out. But again, this is all volunteer work being done by the private community, and there is no support from the government to fund these attorneys.
While the border crisis has made headlines this summer, Washington has yet to react. When Access Minnesota returns, we'll discuss how a deeply divided Congress is complicating efforts to assist the refugees.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now back to our discussion on the border crisis with Michelle Garnett McKenzie and Dipender Mayel from the Advocates for Human Rights. In your opinion, what should the U.S. government be doing to address this crisis and to help improve the living conditions for the children seeking asylum?
Well, one of the things that we need to start with is decoupling the need to provide protection for people seeking asylum from questions about border security. We know that this is not a border security issue because people are showing up and finding Border Patrol agents and turning themselves in. They're not evading Border Patrol. They're not trying to sneak around a checkpoint. They're actively looking for the help of the U.S. government to help protect them from persecution that they fear will happen. So that's an important starting point, is to delink those two questions. The second is to really start to invest and think about stabilizing the countries that are producing refugees. People want to stay in their homes. Kids are not leaving their parents and families. Moms aren't putting small children with them, taking their small children on a train, literally on top of the train, coming to flee their country because they think it will be fun. They're in mortal fear of their kids' lives, and they're doing their best they can to protect them. So we need to look at how, to stabilize those countries, invest in things like domestic violence shelters, where people are able to legitimately seek help from violence when they need it, where they need it, rather than leaving their own country, and making sure that the policies that are really targeting gang violence in the region are effective and are not exacerbating the problem. So that's a second element that needs to be happening. In terms of meeting the children's needs, like any asylum seeker, but especially in the case of children, it's important that we act with compassion. I mean, these are human beings who are asking for a fundamental protection under international human rights law. They're saying, look, I am afraid that I will be persecuted because of who I am, because of what I look like, because of where I live in my country, or my gender and my age. I'm being targeted because of that. for something that is a horrific human rights violation, and I need protection, just like anyone else around the world. We see refugee situations that are tragic around the world every day. Throughout this summer, we've seen a number of situations from Syria to Iraq where people are being forced to flee. This is no different, except that it's our neighbors, and we need to reach out and help them.
And really, when it comes to what the United States should be doing, this isn't something that takes an enormous amount of capacity or an enormous amount of resources to house people not in jails, to house them in proper conditions. And it doesn't take a great leap of thought or innovation to come up to see what fair is. Fair is pretty obvious when it comes to what type of treatment and conditions you'd want to house anybody's children in. The next step would be to make sure that they have access to justice, that their proceedings that they have in court are fair, that attorneys are provided to them, and then also that the way it exists today, right now, it's some of the most challenging asylum law surrounds gang cases. However, some of the most violent stories that we have heard from around the world, and we have clients from Ethiopia, Syria, Somalia, some of the most violent and egregious stories that we're hearing are coming from these three countries, and some of the most extreme violence is being targeted specifically to children, right? And yet they're facing some of the most challenging legal laws on the books. So there needs to be some legal reform around there. There needs to be some changing about what we consider a refugee, and really start to look at these individuals and families less like criminals and terrorists and more like refugees and people who need our protection.
Well, given the deep political divide in Washington, how confident are you that Congress or the Obama administration can do what needs to be done at the border?
Well, you're right that Congress broke for recess this session without having any sort of resolution to what should be happening. The Obama administration is considering right now some administrative actions they can take, but there is real concern that we have both from Congress and from the administration side about the approach that's being taken, especially when it comes to jailing families who are coming into the United States. We talked a little bit earlier about children and where they're placed in shelter care facilities, but when a mom and kids come into the United States together, they aren't put in one of those shelter care facilities. They're put in a jail. They're held behind barbed wire, they're in prison uniforms, and they are treated just like any other prisoner, even though they are a person who has every legal right to be here as someone who's seeking asylum from persecution. So that is something that's deeply troubling in all proposals that are out there. I think that on the positive side, the polling has shown that Americans really are behind reaching out with compassion and making sure that children are met with what we would expect for any child, that they are allowed to, be housed in a way that it makes sense, fed in a way that makes sense, and that they are listened to and allowed to make their case in a way that actually makes sense for American notions of justice. And I think we'll be able to get there.
When Access Minnesota returns, we'll hear about Minnesota's role in helping ease the crisis at the border as thousands of refugee children from Central America look to the U.S. for sanctuary.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Here's more on how Minnesota can help respond to the crisis at our southern border. Are any of the children who are seeking asylum ending up here in Minnesota?
Absolutely. We know that approximately 200 children have come to Minnesota in the last year, and they've been placed in removal proceedings. Many of the children that make their way to Minnesota have some type of family contact, whether it's an uncle or a sister or maybe their parent is here already. And immigration officials are contacting that individual and setting up a way for that child to be released to them until they present themselves in removal hearings. And they will still be placed into deportation proceedings and still have to present their cases.
Congressman Keith Ellison has called on Minnesota Governor Mark Dayton to help provide housing for these children. The governor has responded by saying that the state lacks the necessary resources. Do you think that the governor's opinion on this may change?
You know, it's really difficult to say what the necessary resources are that Minnesota has. And I think the governor and Congressman Ellison both are having a really good conversation about where, really what Minnesota has available right now. The first sort of call over the summer as this really reached crisis proportions came from a few states, a few governors who announced, we have an open, large facility so we can take some of the kids out of Border Patrol stations and put them into, a several hundred or 1,000 person kind of facility where they could be held until they can be reunited with family. And there's no apparent resource here that's ready to have that kind of housing. So I think the governor is working to identify what we really do have, as well as all sorts of other institutions, the charitable institutions that provide basic needs to refugees, to the Latino community, are all looking at what programming is available, what beds are available in shelter space. Everyone's trying to do kind of a head count. The short answer is really that it's not just about getting those kids into moving from one big facility to another, but about making sure that Minnesota is a welcoming place when they get here and find that this is their home while they go through the next few years of their lives. These are young kids. Next few years while they're going through deportation proceedings, living here in Minnesota are going to be hugely important, whether they remain here in our community or end up being deported. We need to make sure that we're doing the best we can for them, and I think we've got the resources at the state level to meet the needs as they start finding their way into families here in our state.
How has the Advocates for Human Rights responded to this crisis?
So we're responding in a number of ways. We represent asylum seekers from around the world who live in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. We represent individuals from over 50 different countries, and we utilize volunteer attorneys in the community to provide that service. To respond to this increase in cases from Central America, we are recruiting a team of volunteer attorneys to specifically handle these cases. We are putting together trainings to handle these cases, and we are also putting together a comprehensive database of materials that can be used around the country by attorneys who are representing these clients, whether they're in Artesia, New Mexico, or whether they're in Texas, or whether they're in Florida, or wherever these children families go. They're going to need resources. These children are going to need lawyers, and these lawyers are going to need materials, and we're trying to provide that for individuals.
What do you say to people who might comment that, well, this is indeed a terrible crisis and I feel very badly for these refugees, but we have our own problems here in the U.S. We can't always open our borders to refugees from every corner of the world. How do you respond to something like that?
Well, in fact, we can. And that is what our international human rights system really demands of not just the United States, but countries around the world, so that we don't end up in a situation where borders are closed for any number of excuses. Our quota of visas is used up, or we don't have anybody from that country already here, or we don't like people from that nationality and we don't want more of them, or they'll be a burden on society. Those were all excuses that were used throughout the 30s and 40s to seal borders and to make sure that refugees who were seeking protection were turned back and sent back to where everyone knew they would face persecution. And after World War II, the world community, led by the United States, really came together and said, this is not acceptable. This is not how we behave as a moral human community. When people are asking for help, we don't necessarily have to grant refugee status, but we have to listen to the request. It's a principle that, I'll say very badly in French, non-refoulement, not returning the child or the asylum seeker before they've had a chance to explain their story and have somebody evaluate whether it meets the criteria for asylum, for refugee status or not. Nobody's saying that all of these children are going to be able to come here and resettle as refugees. What we are saying is that everybody who seeks asylum has a right to seek asylum. And the answer may be no, but it may well be yes. Having a message that is sent to say to children, don't bother coming because our borders are closed to you, is the wrong message. We have to make sure that we don't go back to those days that really spelled atrocities around the world.
The Advocates for Human Rights is responding to this crisis by providing free legal representation to children and families from this region. We are trying to raise money and collect donations to make sure that we have adequate staff to respond to this crisis. So one thing that you can do is get involved by making a donation to the Advocates and becoming more involved with our organization. If you are a volunteer attorney or you have other skills that you think that could help in this process, you should also contact us, because part of our mission and our model is to see how all of our community can be involved in the human rights process. And we are committed to using volunteers and to utilizing the community to really achieve our human rights goals.
Michelle Garnett McKenzie and Dipender Mayal are with the Advocates for Human Rights. Michelle, Dipender, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.